Is it possible that there is a 3,000-year-old mystery that has been determining the course of your life without you even knowing it? And is it possible that this mystery is what lies behind the rise and fall of nations, as well as the world wars that we've seen in the last century and a half? And is it possible that this mystery also holds the key to what lies ahead of us for the rest of this decade? If so, this is a mystery that we cannot afford to be ignorant of any longer. My name is Arleen Westerhof, and in this week's weekly word of prophetic encouragement, I'm going to talk to you about what exactly this mystery is and why it is so important for us to know it. Why? Because as we are aware of it, we become those who are like Issachar, the tribe, knowing the times and the seasons, but also knowing what we and our families and our churches and our nations need to do. Before I start, however, I'd just like to say, if you haven't yet subscribed to my Arleen Westerhof YouTube channel, please take a moment to do so now. Now, today, I'm going to be talking about a 3,000-year-old mystery that has actually been in effect for 3 millennia and that is influencing the course of our daily lives and is influencing things that are influencing us. Now, in order to start this, I go back to a scene in the book of Exodus, an old man standing on a mountaintop, fire, clouds, thunder, and the children of Israel standing at the base of the mountain and looking up in fear. And as this man, Moshe in Hebrew, or Moses as we know him, as he's on the top of the mountain, God speaks to him and he starts to record what God is saying. And what he records becomes what we know today as the Torah. And in the Torah, God gave Moses instructions for the children of Israel for how to organize their daily lives and how to organize their national institutions and how to organize himself as a nation. And in that instructing, God started to talk about Sabbath, that whole principle of rest for people and for land and for capital. And in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 1, God starts to talk very specifically about something. And today I'm not going to talk about a Sabbath rest so much for people every seventh day, but I am going to talk about something else. Leviticus chapter 25, I'm going to read the first 4 verses. And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord." And so that Sabbath principle for individuals, but we're talking now about a Sabbath for the land. 6 years you shall plow your field, and 6 years you shall plant your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. And you shall neither sow nor reap your field or prune your vineyard. And what grows of its own accord, I'm going to read to verse 5, of your harvest you shall not reap, nor gather grapes of your untended vine, for it is a year of rest for the land. Now, God commanded that very, very specifically for Israel, his covenant nation. And that is a command that has never been rescinded. On that 7th year, however, there was also another Sabbath, and it was a Sabbath of rest for capital. And Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, God talks about that very, very seriously. One of the things I'm noticing as prophets of God is that we have to start to become aware of these things now so that we can become even more accurate in our prophesying. We're talking about an Issachar generation right now that God is raising up to know the times and the seasons and what our different nations need to do. This is incredibly important. And so we need to be aware of these concepts. Deuteronomy 15, verses 1 and 2. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. And this is the form of the release. Every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Interestingly enough, that term release can also be translated with the Hebrew word Shemitah. And that is the mystery that is 3,000 years old that we are now talking about. Shemitah, translated release or remission. And remission means a cancellation or reduction of debt or penalty. And so the Shemitah concerns every 7th year, and it has to do with both the land as well as capital. And so as a result, the Shemitah principle that God gave, it wasn't even a principle, it was a command that God gave to the nation of Israel. If it has to do with land in an agrarian society and capital, we would expect to see this manifesting itself every 7 years in some form or another, in both the economic as well as the financial life of the nation. And if we talk about economics and finances, then we also got to talk about the political sphere and war. And so why am I discussing this topic today? It's because these things are still some of the things that I see that are driving us forward in this decade, this era now of wars and rumors of wars. And as God's prophets, we have to understand how they work. Would you just take a moment, type into your chat, if you agree with that, say, I am a prophet. All right? And if you're not so sure, type in as a statement of faith, I am prophetic. Now, the Shemitah, as we talked about, it has to do with every 7 years. The Shemitah also was what was behind the fall of Israel. Now that is very, very interesting. And I can see even some of you looking at your screens and saying, what is this woman saying? But if we talk about the fall of Israel, we know that when God led the nation of Israel into the promised land, that he gave them certain promises. And in Deuteronomy chapter 28, God talks about if they keep his commands and his ordinances, the things that he had commanded them to observe, to actually do and to keep, then they would be blessed in their coming, they'd be blessed in their going, they'd be blessed in their fields, they'd be blessed in their homes. God initiated, his commands and the Shemitah to be a blessing to his covenant people. However, he also said in Deuteronomy chapter 28, if you should not do these things, if you should disobey me, then cursed would you be in your coming and going. You will be cursed in your fields. You will be cursed in your homes. And in the end, the scriptures even say that the people would be driven off of the land that they had been given by God. And so we see the Shemitah, this year of release, of remission, as it were. It's about every 7th year, and it has to do with land, it has to do with capital. And Leviticus chapter 26, verse 31 through 35, is something that actually is also in play right now. Because Leviticus chapter 26, verses 31 through 35 says something else. And that says, God says, I will lay your cities waste if you don't obey me. And if you don't obey this ordinance, and I will bring your sanctuaries to desolation. I will not smell the fragrance of your sweet aromas. And he said, I will bring the land to desolation, and your enemies who dwell in it will be astonished at it. And God says, if they did not obey, said he would scatter them among the nations and would draw out a sword after them. Their land would be desolate, their cities lie waste. And here it is, actually, and then in verse 32, the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths. As long as it lies desolate, and you are in your enemy's land, then the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbath. As long as it lies desolate, it shall rest. For the time it did not rest on your Sabbaths when you dwelt in it. And so what was God saying here? God was saying here that as a consequence of disobedience, if the nation of Israel were supposed to do that, then he would drive them out of their land, and he would give the land the Sabbath rest every 7th year that they had not observed it. The land, one way or another, would get its Sabbath. And that has huge consequences. Why do I say that? Because in 586 before Christ, Israel went into exile. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, actually took the people of Israel into exile. And Israel's land lay desolate for 70 years while the people were in exile. And God spoke before they left the nation. There would be 1 year for every Shemitah year, every Sabbath year, every 7th year that the children of Israel had failed to observe the Shemitah of the Lord. So we see that the Shemitah of God has a couple of aspects. It has a personal aspect. Israel was required to adhere to that individually, every Israelite. It also has a corporate aspect. Every family was expected to keep the Shemitahs and the Sabbaths of the Lord. It has a national aspect because the nation itself was supposed to do this. But now we see, even with Israel going into exile, that the Shemitah also has a global aspect to it. Could it be that the Lord raised up Nebuchadnezzar at the time that he did in order to allow the land to keep its Shemitahs? And when the 70 years of exile was through, which God had proclaimed through his prophets, that he then raised up another nation, the Persians, who came against the Babylonians and defeated them. And Israel was able to go back to its own land. This is the mystery of God's Shemitah, and it doesn't just extend to Israel. As we start to look at this mystery, and as we start to extend it now to what it means for us today and for other nations, there are a few things we have to do. First of all, we have to discern between God's ordinances and his prophetic signs. Type for a moment into your text thing, or your chat thing on your computer, discern between ordinances and prophetic signs. Discern between ordinances and prophetic signs. God's ordinances were for his covenant people, but God's word is true. If we keep his ways, if we walk in his paths, this is for all of us, then he will bless us. And if we turn from him in disobedience, then we will be cursed. Israel did that. They were cursed, but they remain God's covenant people. All right? But for the rest of us who have been grafted in by the blood of Jesus Christ, we can expect the same blessings, but we can also expect to see the same patterns in our personal lives, but also in our nations. Now, this is the end of this first video on the mystery of the Shemitah. However, in my next video, and please be sure to not only not miss it yourself, but to share this video with those who you know. I'm making these videos for those of you who are called to be prophetic voices to your families, to your churches, to your nations, and those who are called to be prophetic solutionists, so that you can have eyes to see, ears to hear, and to know what's happening and what we should do now at this time. In my next video, I'm going to talk about how this affects now to the geopolitical arena, how it relates to it, to USA-China relations, to what's happening now across the globe. I'm going to talk in my next video about how the Shemitah principle, the mystery of the Shemitah, actually has concretely been manifesting itself in nations outside of Israel and also across the globe, and how these things have impacted your life personally. But even as important, I'm going to talk about what we can expect to see for the rest of this decade in light of God's revealed ordinance of the Shemitah for his people Israel, but for all who would believe. Thank you for joining me this week in my weekly word of prophetic encouragement, and I look forward to seeing you next week.